In the 9th century, Europe was haunted by a single collective nightmare. A man who possessed neither high lineage, nor a crown, nor even a scrap of land to call his own. Medieval chroniclers spent centuries attempting to erase his name, for it had become synonymous with a primal terror that descended from the north. The world came to know him as Hastein, the last pure-blooded Viking of the old school, a man who refused on principle to play by the rules of a new era. He emerged onto the pages of the annals as if from nowhere, destined to become the shadow and mentor to the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. Hastein led armadas through the Strait of Gibraltar, ravaged the coasts of Morocco, and took Italian cities by storm, employing cunning where even Viking steel failed. But here lies the paradox. Possessing power capable of crushing empires and enough gold to purchase a kingdom outright, he remained known as the King without a shore, a man who mastered the art of seizing everything, yet had no desire to hold onto anything. We are about to walk in his footsteps to witness how a mysterious captain with no past became the spiritual father of the most powerful warrior dynasty in Europe. Why the greatest Mediterranean odyssey ended for him not with a throne, but with the return to the river mists of France. How Hastein turned the Loire and the Seine into his private hunting grounds, where the kings of the Franks served merely as the game, and the fatal price he paid for attempting to challenge the wisest king of England, Alfred the Great. Before us unfolds the drama of a man who elevated the art of the raid to the rank of high politics, but in the end found himself obsolete in a world he had helped destroy. In the 9th century, when Europe was beginning to grow accustomed to the names of sea kings whose genealogies claimed descent from the gods, the name Hastein rang out with a strange dissonance. His personality was not sung in the sagas, and in the lists of heirs to the thrones of Denmark or Norway he did not appear at all. This chieftain burst into history as a man without a past, a riddle that scholars have been trying to solve for over 1,000 years. The chronicler Dudo of St. Quentin, describing this enemy, did not hide his hatred, calling him the tutor of the sons of Ragnar, and a man whose treacherous mind far exceeded his brute strength. Some sources whispered the incredible, that by blood he was not a Northman at all, but hailed from a peasant family near Troy. A fugitive who joined the Vikings, adopted their faith, and soon surpassed his mentors in fury. Whoever this warrior truly was, a renegade Frank or a Scandinavian outcast, the essence remains the same. He embodied a new breed of leaders, meritocrats of war, who seized power by right of conquest, not by right of birth. In a world where status was defined by land and ancestors, Hastein chose the sea. As we analyzed in detail in our episode on Björn Ironside, it was Hastein who became the mentor for Björn's young son, passing on to him the philosophy of war as a profitable business. The Sea King believed that the world was merely a map to be redrawn to suit one's own sails. But the more riches he amassed, the clearer it became. He had no roots capable of anchoring him in the storm of history. The Viking was possessed by the certainty that he was forging an eternal name, but in reality he remained only a shadow without a family crest in the chronicles of those he ruthlessly plundered. In 859, he decides on an act designed to bring him out of the shadow of the legendary Lothbroks. Together with his protege, the chieftain assembles an armada of 62 ships. To appreciate the scale, these vessels carried approximately 3,000 professional warriors. For the 9th century, such a force seemed colossal. The army represented a single, mobile, and highly professional organism that outnumbered practically any garrison a European monarch could field in the moment. The fleet sliced through Gibraltar, bursting into the Mediterranean Sea, the internal lake of Christians and Muslims. This was a campaign for the heart of the world. The Northmen crashed down upon Morocco and forced the kings of Spain to pay astronomical sums of 90,000 gold dinars. These funds would have been enough to maintain an entire mercenary army for years. Hastein felt like the master of the southern seas, watching the walls of Italian cities crumble before him. According to legends, the culmination of the campaign was the siege of the city of Luni, which the Sea King mistakenly took for the Great Rome. Here he applied his famous cunning. Pretending to be dead, he forced the townspeople to carry his coffin inside the walls for a Christian burial. When the corpse leapt up with a sword in hand, the city fell in a matter of minutes. But the triumph turned into bitter disappointment. The captured fortress proved to be only a pale shadow of the greatness he sought. It was not Rome. This moment laid bare the leader's main weakness. He was a brilliant tactician capable of deceiving a bishop, but remained a political blind man beyond the decks of his ships. Hastein assumed that by taking Rome, he would automatically transform into a new emperor. In reality, he had sacked a provincial town and wasted years for nothing. The image of the great Viking jumping out of a coffin in the wrong place became a symbol of audacity powerless before its own ignorance. The Mediterranean turned into a golden cage for him, luxurious but empty. In 862, after 3 years of wandering, the battered fleet returned to the mouth of the Loire. It was here that the paths of the teacher and the student diverged forever. Björn, whose reputation now thundered across all of Europe, departed for the north to lay claim to the Swedish throne. If you want to know how the fate of Ironside played out in the icy waters of Scandinavia, be sure to watch our previous episode. Hastein, however, deprived of royal blood, was left alone with the fogs of France. He realized, to control a country, one does not necessarily need to wear a crown. It is enough to hold a knife to the throat of its trade arteries. The victory in Italy brought gold but gave no legitimacy, and now Hastein vitally needed a foothold he could call his own without bending the knee to a king. He would dedicate the next 20 years to a plan that would bring the Franks to their knees. The chieftain would create a system of island fortresses, turning the rivers into personal domains where kings would pay him for the right to simply breathe the air of their own country. But it was precisely this success that would become his most dangerous trap. Upon returning from the Mediterranean campaign, Hastein discovered that the path to Scandinavia was closed. Having no rights to a crown, the chieftain relied only on his loyal crew and his own calculation. The king transforms France into his personal dominion, shifting his focus to the valleys of the Loire and the Seine. The Viking no longer thirsts for one-off raids. He methodically settles the rivers, turning river islands like Ocel into impregnable bases for his longships. However, his path was blocked by Robert the Strong, the progenitor of royal dynasties and the shield of France. In 866, Hastein concludes a daring alliance with the Bretons, clashing with his adversary in the Battle of Brisarth. Imagine this moment. 2 of the most powerful forces of the era locked in a clinch for power over the western lands. Pinned against the walls of a stone church, the Northmen resembled prey backed into a corner. But the Sea King turned desperation into a deadly trap. When Robert the Strong, buoyed by imminent success, removed his armor due to the exhausting heat, Hastein personally led the counterattack. Just picture it, cold steel piercing the unprotected chest of the greatest warrior of the Franks. The death of the Count of Anjou buried the country's hope for swift deliverance. By killing the leader, Hastein calculated he would break the entire kingdom. However, instead of triumph, he turned into the primary target for the Carolingian Empire, a man who cuts short not just the lives of soldiers, but the future of entire dynasties. By 872, the king's ambitions had grown. He captured Angers, turning the city into a fortified headquarters. King Charles the Bald fielded a massive army against him and began a siege. However, the mighty walls and the combat experience of the Northmen ruled out the possibility of a direct assault. Then the Franks turned the tactics of the invaders against them. Engineering detachments began to construct a grandiose dam to divert the channel of the River Main. Thousands of laborers dug into the earth day and night with a single goal: to leave the longships stranded on dry sand. Thus began the first large-scale engineering duel in history between Vikings and a European crown. Noticing the water receding from the hulls, Hastein did not succumb to panic. He turned inevitable defeat into a profitable deal. Instead of dying in the silty riverbed, the chieftain bargained for the right to remain in the region as an ally, receiving gold and recognition of status. Diplomacy triumphed over steel. Using the city walls as a bargaining chip, Hastein proved he was not merely a pirate, but a veritable state within a state. After the events at Angers, the Sea King ceased to be merely an enemy. He transformed into a necessary evil. Frankish counts and Breton dukes, bogged down in internecine feuds, realized, instead of trying to destroy the wolf, it was more profitable to put a mercenary's collar on him. The victory at Bresarth made him the master of the situation, but now the time had come to legalize his presence so as not to be crushed by the next monarch. Thus began a great political game where betrayal was valued higher than valor. The chieftain would spend the next 15 years in the shadows, playing the role of the gray eminence of the French rivers. He would betray, defend, and plunder again, gradually becoming richer than any legitimate duke. But while Hastein enjoyed the influence of a puppet master, the world around him was changing rapidly. A new generation of monarchs was building bridges that could no longer be rammed. The River King felt in his gut his time in France was relentlessly running out. After the year 873, Hastein's career takes a strange turn. Instead of directing his fleet into the unknown, he gets bogged down in endless negotiations. For a decade, the king balances between the interests of the Breton duke and the Frankish kings, gradually becoming a river mercenary. The experienced Viking realized open war costs too much, whereas managed chaos yields pure profit. The chieftain built a scheme where he received money for refraining from looting and simultaneously for attacking the employer's enemies. This approach embodied the absolute limit of Viking cynicism. Hastein hoped he had become an indispensable element of the political game, yet in reality he was merely gifting the Franks precious time. While the Sea King reveled in the role of arbiter in other people's disputes, the European military machine was adapting to his methods. By the year 882, luck on the Loire had finally turned away from him. The Franks began constructing low fortified bridges that blocked the path of longships upstream. For a Viking who bet everything on mobility, such obstacles meant a death sentence. The rivers, which previously served the chieftain as veins, were turning into traps. Deprived of the Loire, the old king shifts his activity to the Seine and the lands of Picardy. Although there is no direct proof, historians believe that it was here his path crossed with the young Rollo. But if the future Duke of Normandy was looking for a way to integrate into this world, Hastein saw only walls rising ever higher. Imagine the warrior gazing upon the new fortifications of Paris. He realizes that the tactic of control without responsibility has exhausted itself. The resources of the lands were depleted, and the resistance of professional armies grew stronger with each day. In the year 890, the veteran faces his most difficult choice. Having crossed the 50-year mark, an age of deep old age for the 9th century, he feels his former glory fading. Hastein saw France was uniting around new leaders, inclined toward the very state-building he had always shunned. It became clear either he would die a mercenary or he would be strangled in a blockade. He desperately needed a new world where the old rules of raiding could still bring a crown. The chieftain's gaze turned to the misty shores of England. A great war was raging there, and Hastein believed his experience would serve as the weight capable of tipping the scales. The old Viking risked everything: his accumulated treasures, his last fleet, and the safety of his own family. In the year 892, Hastein orders the sails raised on 80 ships. The fleet carried not just raiders, this was a mass emigration of an entire army. He was leaving France, which he had tormented for 30 years, leaving behind ashes and those bitter lessons that Rollo would later use. However, on that shore, the flotilla was awaited by Alfred the Great, a king who was building not just bridges, but a nation. Hastein expected to speak with him from the position of a predator, but the old man did not yet suspect that in England he would meet his mirror image, a man capable of turning another's cunning into a deadly trap. In 892, Hastein makes a decision that becomes the culmination of his long career. He redeploys his forces to England, where decades prior the great heathen army had already seized vast territories. The old king led a fleet of 80 ships. Just imagine, 80 longships held about 4,000 hardened veterans. Hastein landed in the mouth of the Thames, hoping to repeat his French triumph, seize a beachhead, erect an island fortress, and dictate terms. The Sea King assumed that England remained merely a collection of disjointed lands that could easily be pillaged one by one. But in reality, he had walked into a trap prepared over years. Opposing him stood Alfred the Great, the monarch who was the first to realize, to defeat a Viking, one must stop thinking like a victim and start building a system. The clash between Hastein and Alfred marked the battle of two different worlds. Hastein applied his favorite tactic. He fortified himself in the fort of Benfleet. But Alfred countered him with the Burgos system, a network of fortified towns separated by only a day's march. The situation was becoming critical. Wherever Hastein's raiding party went, it inevitably ran into a garrison. The old king, standing on the ramparts of his camp, watched as a ring of palisades and Saxon iron helmets tightened around him. In 893, while Hastein was out on a raid, the Anglo-Saxons stormed his camp at Benfleet. The captors took everything: the gold, the fleet, and the chieftain's family. Such a blow seemed crushing. Alfred's state strategy proved more effective than pirate cunning. The subsequent events completely baffled historians. Alfred the Great made an unexpected gesture. He returned Hastein's wife and children to him. Moreover, the king stood as godfather to one of the chieftain's sons. This act did not signify weakness. It embodied the highest form of psychological victory. Alfred demonstrated to Hastein his sons now belonged to the Christian world, and the old Viking himself was merely a relic of a passing era. Hastein resisted for another 3 years, thrashing about England, losing men, until in 896 his name simply disappeared from the chronicles. He did not fall in a great battle. He dissolved into the mist of history, like a shadow fading in the light of day. Hastein departed without leaving behind castles or laws, but his failure served as the most valuable lesson for the Northmen. He proved the model of the eternal raid is dead. To survive in Europe, a Viking was obliged to cease being merely a destroyer. Hastein cleared the political field of France and England with his fury, preparing the soil for those who would come after and call themselves Normans. Hastein traveled the path from an unknown captain to a warrior who held the monarchs of Europe's two greatest powers in fear. He embodied the image of the ideal Viking raider, whose shelter was the deck of a longship, and whose primary law was the right of the strong. In the twilight of his years, he attempted to conquer England, but crashed against a power he failed to comprehend, the power of state order. His fall marked the finale of the old-school era of Northmen. Paradoxically, it was Hastein's unwillingness to settle down and negotiate that proved to the other jarls the future belongs to those who trade the axe for the signet ring. World chronicles confirm power resting only on fear and plunder is a foundation that eventually turns to dust. This truth has remained unchanged since the 9th century. Destruction spawns myths, but only creation builds civilizations. These events served merely as the beginning of a massive transformation. While Hastein was dissolving into obscurity, another fleet was approaching the mouth of the Seine. Commanding it was a man who had carefully studied the miscalculations of his predecessor. This leader dared to take the step Hastein had rejected. He decided to take the vassal oath, so that generations later his descendants would try on real crowns. The name of this man is Rollo, a leader whose signature on a peace treaty forever redrew the map of Europe and gave birth to a new nation, the Normans. His journey from sea brigand to duke became a legend that has not lost its luster to this day. Subscribe to see the birth of Normandy. Hit the like button if the dead Viking trick in Luna impressed you. Share in the comments, would Hastein have managed to hold the throne if he had actually captured Rome? Thanks for watching. See you next time.